Thank you so much for coming to this episode of the Reflection Room. Today, we're going to talk about some tools, but Christian tools that can help with anxiety. So, thank you, Natalie, for joining us in this part two. I'm so excited to be running this series of Christian counseling.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited. I know I had a blast recording the first one, and I know there were a lot of people that really enjoyed listening to it, and so many great things came out of it. In fact, even one of our therapists messaged me privately and said that he really enjoyed listening to it too. So I'm excited to record the second one. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, yes, I feel this part two was needed because the first part we did talk about anxiety, what we thought, what the scripture said about anxiety. But in this time around, since we are in this counseling field, I definitely want to migrate both counseling and Christianity and give people tools that are actually Christian based, that we can find scripture, find, that relay on the Bible and Christian principles. So,
hmm
what are maybe one or the most like common for you that comes to mind to tell our clients or people that are watching us about one
Yeah.
of the tools?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Before I share it, because uh, I don't know about you, but there's so many times, not necessarily with counseling, although that has happened to me too, but there's so many times that I might go to a different form of like doctors or providers, and I'm going to find answers or to get tools. And I feel like I walk away and I don't really know what to do next. I feel like I've gone in, maybe I've gotten some information, I've heard a lot of stuff, and then I leave, and if somebody were to ask me, "Okay, so what do you do next?" I'm like, "I don't know." So I think like these kinds of episodes are really helpful because although it's great to get psychoeducation, which is what we call just like knowledge and information, better understanding whatever it is that we find ourselves struggling with. I think also like tools and techniques, like something like this that you suggested, is really helpful so that we feel like there are practical things that we can do on our own to be able to better help our situations. So there's so many things that come to mind that I've utilized either in my personal life or with clients over the years. It really does depend. I hate to give this broad answer. It does depend on the individual person and their specific situation. You and I both know that, like with counseling, individual treatment plans are key. Anytime that you're going to a counselor and they give you something that is very broad and very general and very, yeah, just very generalized, you wanna run. You do not want to stay working with that provider. You want something that is very specific, and very tailored to your needs. So, I just wanna put that out there. So it does depend on the person that we're working with, but there are a few things that come to mind when I think about, somebody that maybe has come to my office and has shared with me that they are struggling with, anxiety or anxiety-like symptoms, and also they identify as a Christian, as a believer, or they just want to incorporate some kind of spirituality into their day-to-day life because they feel like that's going to provide some kind of anchor or foundation. So, one of the things that's the most common one, although I do have a few others that aren't as common, but one of the most common ones that comes to mind is like the interconnectedness or the combination of like CBT practices or the CBT approach, and then also just scripture. So when you think of CBT, right, there's the cognitive and the behavioral piece. And so the idea behind it is if we change the way that we think, so if we change our thoughts, if we change our negative thought patterns, then naturally that's going to change our behaviors.
Mhm.
And so the idea behind it from a Christian perspective is if we're able to replace some of our negative thinking, in this case, it would be our anxious thinking, our fearful thinking, our doubtful thinking with something that is a little bit more positive, a little bit more hopeful, then eventually that is going to lead to a more positive outcome, essentially. We would take, whatever those anxious thoughts are, whatever those fearful thoughts are, whatever those doubtful or hopeless thoughts are, and then we would begin to see what exactly does the Bible say about that, or what are some um, more encouraging scriptures or verses that we can find that relate to that. that they might be able to recite, they might be able to meditate on, they might be able to kind of tease apart, gain a deeper understanding of, that they can kind of like anchor themselves to, root themselves to, gain kind of a firmer foundation in to help them kind of get through those more difficult moments. So that's the most common one that comes to mind. Everybody knows for the most part nowadays what CBT is. You know, it's a pretty commonplace term nowadays in our society. And so that's the one that I would say is probably the most popular.
I love that. For me, it comes to mind like an example, like let's say a scripture that I'm gonna talk about me too. Like there was a time in my life that I feel very anxious and I feel like I needed to do something. Like, it comes like, oh my God, what do I do to change this reality? So, and God showed me several times that be still verse
Mm,
of the Bible. So I feel that we can maybe, let's say in this example, trade all my anxiety and all what I wanted to do for, okay, no, God is inviting me to be still in this time or in this season of my life. So let me trade all my worries for, okay, be still because he knows better.
mm.
So what do you think about that? Because I feel that for me in this moment, thinking about anxiety, it takes me to that moment in that scripture.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, you know. So another example that comes to mind, sometimes people might feel when they're anxious. So for example, panic disorders or panic attack, which is something that happens if somebody has, let's say, like a panic disorder of some sort or an anxiety attack. The idea behind it is that your body is freaking out and there's extra adrenaline that's happening there. And there's this subconscious thought that there is some kind of life like threatening situation in front of you, right? And so your body kind of goes into like this fight or flight mode. And so, a person might be thinking, whether they realize it or not, I'm not safe, and so your body's responding to this thought. I feel like I'm not safe, right? And so, to what you're saying here, then we might suggest, then if we're using this kind of tool, we might suggest to someone that maybe they might think like, God is my protector, which comes from Psalm 91. And somebody who's listening to this might think, but that how is that calming? Somebody who's not a believer, somebody who is not faith-based, they might think I that wouldn't calm me down, or I wouldn't find that to be, soothing in any
Shooting.
way. Well, that's not a tool then that would work for them. But somebody who does find peace in knowing that there is something greater out there than themselves, right? Then finds peace in knowing that although I might feel unsafe in this moment, I find peace in knowing that there is a God out there that is larger than me, who is out there, who is protecting me.
Mhm.
And so that would be, yeah, an example of like what we're talking about, a way to be able to take an anxious thought and replace it with something that is found in scripture.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. I have another tool. So this is my own prayer journal. So
Yeah.
when I've been going through things, it says Kim first. So this is my prayer journal. I love it. And this is another tool that I also want to share. Normally, what I do is kind of write letters to God, depending on how I'm
Mm,
feeling. So it could go around like, Lord, I feel anxious about this problem. Help me trust you, help me go through it or give them the wisdom, guide me through X or Y
mm,
situation. And, I have wrote, let's say since last year, and sometimes I go back and read it and I have seen how much I have grown in my faith too, and personally, but also like the things that God has done in my life as well. That He not only maybe took me out of certain situations, but also was faithful in others. Like maybe blessed me so much that I was like, at that time when I wrote that, I would never have imagined that I'd be leaving what I'm leaving right now or I'm
uh,
experiencing right now. So I love comparing those times with the present and seeing how faithful also God has been with me.
huh? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I really do. It reminds me of, well, as a therapist, as a clinician, right? Journaling is something that we recommend often, and it's become so common and so popular that I mean, there's so many apps out there nowadays that people can download, and it's literally at our fingertips. There's an app that I use right now that I won't go into it, but I personally love, and just like the way that they have kind of orchestrated it, or like orchestrated different tools within the app. It allows us to kind of creatively journal, which I really like. But we know that there's something about kind of getting things out of our heads and writing it down. So we call it brain dumping, right? And then there's something to be said about recording. You and I know that when somebody comes into our sessions and they've like tracked or recorded their experiences, then we're able to kind of look and identify patterns, and we're able to identify triggers, and we're able to identify warning
Uh-huh.
signs. And then that's what we can kind of help our clients kind of walk through, ways to be able to help them through their specific needs, but through from a Christian lens. I think about like the book of Psalms and David, and that's what comes to mind. Is his experiences of like, now granted they were in song form, but I think about his experiences as he's kind of like almost like dumping all of his emotions, right? As far as like what he's experiencing in that specific moment. And you can almost like follow his human experience. And he's kind of he goes through anger and frustration and loneliness and bitterness and resentment, but then also, uh, he talks about his trust and hope that the Lord is going to pull him through. And it's so relatable as a reader when you're reading it, that you're like, "Oh, I can almost find myself in his words as I'm kind of reading through." And so, yeah, so I personally, when I'm talking to clients about journaling, it's like I'm telling them to Christian clients, I'm telling them to do that, but then also sometimes I might have them read certain parts of the Bible that almost kind of, for me, jump out as journal entries. And for me, it's the book of Psalms. I feel like it's almost like we're getting a sneak peek of like David's journal entries as he's kind of walking through his own experiences. So yeah, I think it's a phenomenal tool. Does it work for everyone? No. But there's different ways of journaling too. So this is something that I've talked about with my clients before, but I'm not personally someone that can sit down and like write like "Dear Me," or, for you, you said you write to God specifically. I have a client that I've worked with. I don't know if she'll see this, but she writes letters specifically to God, which I absolutely love. So I've never been able to do that. But for me, a way that I've journaled is there are three things that I specifically will look for every day. So I'll look for something that I have seen, something that I've heard, and then something that I have felt that day. And that's a way for me to be able to be like present in my day. And I actually got that from a mission trip that I went on
I love
one
it.
year, and they wanted us to be present during that mission trip, and it was a great experience. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, I'll just sit down and think about what is one thing that I heard, what is one thing that I saw, and what's one thing that I felt. And it's very quick, very short, but it's also very impactful. So there's different ways to journal as well. But yeah, I think it's a great tool for people.
I love that because as being in a grounding technique, like when you incorporate more than one of your senses, it makes you be more aware. And actually, I found like I heard that from Jay Shetty. I know he's not Christian, but I love that part because he's like, when you want to ground, you want to incorporate at least two or three parts
Correct.
of your senses. So I love that. I want to also piggyback on you mentioned about great King David and the Psalms. So with the Psalms, I want to tweak it a little bit in today's date and in land and worshiping and music, and how that's also very healing in a type of therapy too, because encourage just encourages us to listen and to be also attentive to the lyrics, and like also creating maybe that playlist for you when you are in those like sad moments or anxious moments. I do that. Like, I'm
Hmm.
liable for that. Like, when I just wanna worship, I'm like, "Okay, let me just have my Bible, like, or worshiping, like, modern version," and I
Hmm.
can just jam it while I'm driving or when I'm exercising or just like, house duties too. And I love it
Mhm.
because I'm so Latina too. So there's like some
Mhm.
salsa, like Christian version, reggaeton. I love that. I have somebody that,
Mhm.
a friend of mine, his name is Carrick. He's actually, well, that's his artistic name. And he
Mhm.
does like reggaeton, but Christian reggaeton. So it's super
Oh.
nice. Yes. So this is like another tool that our clients or people that watch us can also use. Like, hey, like worshiping is praying like David did, but it's praying, but in another way, like in a
Mhm.
musical or another type of way. And some people like me are maybe very driven into music. So it will be like a very nice tool to put in place as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to I would personally say to relax. There's different relaxation techniques, right? Looking at through a clinical lens. And so I think you mentioned earlier at the beginning of this episode, you mentioned something briefly about like breath work. So there's breath work and then there's, like muscle relaxation techniques and there's guided imagery and visualization. And there's so many different relaxation techniques that we recommend and use with our clients. But I would say that would be another way for people to relax. But another thing that's really actually pretty impactful about, like, let's say music specifically from a clinical perspective is that I've been doing a lot of, I won't go into the technicalities of it, but people can look it up, like polyvagal theory, and it talks a lot about like this sympathetic and parasympathetic systems that we have operating in us. And there's something to be said about what's the word I'm looking for? Not necessarily rhythms, but like patterns sometimes that can help us like relax our nervous system. So that's why you'll see sometimes with little kids or babies that they will like kind of rock themselves to
Yeah.
calm themselves, right? So that there's something in that pattern that kind of helps relax them and soothe them. That's why massages can be, besides the fact that I'm not a masseuse, so I don't know exactly what's like coming out with, as they're like massaging us, but there's something in the pattern of the massaging that helps with the relaxation, and then also with the, like, rhythms of music and stuff like that, that there's something there with the rhythm and the patterns that we naturally find to be very soothing and relaxing. So that's why there's a such thing called, like, music therapy, right? So I would say, like, that is something that is very therapeutic, and then I just, naturally, I think about looking at it through a Christian perspective, and thinking about it in terms of like the Bible. Again, I go back to David. I mean, David was known to, okay, back in the day, this was, I wouldn't say normal because I think some people probably looked at him and thought he was a little bit out of his mind, but he was known to kind of go dancing in the streets. And granted, I think he might have been dancing in the streets naked. I don't know, but there was something there. But anyways, he would go dancing in the streets and he was just kind of known for that. So, and he played the harp and he was a musician, right? And again,
Very
the
talented.
Psalms were songs. Yeah. And so there's something to be said about worship and music and praise. That is a form of expression that allows us to be able to connect with ourselves, with others in community and congregations as we're gathering in our places of worship, and then obviously with God. And so I think there's benefits all around with that specifically. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And I love the application also in the Bible. I love that. One last technique that I want to talk about, but I wanted also to put together with the first episode we did. I talk about casting fears to God or
Mm.
casting our burdens to God. So I have a box, you know, I'm always so visual. I was
No,
like,
I
I
love
think it's
that.
the teacher in me. A box where it's like basically my prayer box, but I wanna also call it casting burdens exercise. Like I write a prayer, I close it up, I put a date, and then I put it in my box. And basically, you can also call it the God's box, because I just put it in trust that God is going to work in this at His time. But
Mm,
at some point, obviously, with my faith, I hope to take at least
mm,
one of those papers and read it back and feel like, okay, God has worked in this for me. So it's basically just placing my prayers and my worries to God and just trusting that He will do them. And then, also seeing how God has worked in my life with my prayers is nice to also see the faithfulness that He has, have for me as well. So it's just trusting God and putting those away. I have like at least one or two here that I need to read and give thanks to God and rip it or burn it or do something with
Aw,
it because God has already worked with my life in these prayers. So this is another invitation. It has a little pencil, and then you can write it and I keep it in my office.
I
And
love
then
that.
this
Yeah.
is another way that I feel that you put your prayers in writing and do that exercise as journaling. I feel that writing has a magic power in my lens and just trusting God and putting this away like, God, I trust you. I know that you're going to work this in your time. So for me, that I'm
Mm.
actually an anxious patient too,
Mhm.
it,
Mhm.
it's cool to feel that I trust God and I can trust Him with my worries and needs. So this is like one of like the last exercises and tools that I wanted to share.
Yeah, I think it's such a great idea. I feel like I need to create something like that. I think it's a great idea, but and then I think it's a good visual representation, right? Of like um, what the Bible calls us to do as believers. And then also, I was thinking as you were talking, I was like, huh. I was thinking of it from a clinical perspective. Again, we're thinking about the ways that like
Mhm.
psychology or mental health and Christianity kind of merge or cross. And I was just talking about like relaxation techniques, and so I'm almost very similar to the way like breath work. There's a certain type of breath work where we like inhale something and we exhale. So we might, as we're inhaling, we're thinking of the anxiety, but then as we're exhaling, we might exhale like the word peace or something like that. And then very
Mhm.
similar to muscle relaxation techniques, we might, as we're releasing the tension in our muscles, we might visualize releasing the anxiety from our bodies, right? And so as you were talking, I was like, huh, it's very similar to this idea of relaxation, but from a spiritual perspective, it's almost like you're surrendering, these things that you find yourself maybe anxious about or worried about or fearful of, or just you find yourself staying up late at night thinking about, and it's a visual of you kind of surrendering all of that to him and saying like, I'm trusting you to handle, these parts of it that I don't know what to do and I can't do and it's not within my strength to do. And so I love that idea, Stephanie. Yeah, very encouraging.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, you touch a very good idea as well, like breathing and meditation, but meditating in scripture. Like just reminding that you have a God that He can do the impossible that you might not be
Mhm.
able to do, but with the breathing in and exhaling or breathing out, and maybe incorporating here and there like scriptures like, hey, no, God, be still in scriptures of that sort while you breathe and meditate in that and think, okay, what does this word really mean in my life? Like, how can I even apply this? So that's a very good idea too, in combining breath work and meditation, but from
Mhm.
a Christian perspective. So I love that. So
Mhm.
thank you so much, Natalie,
Yes,
joining
yeah,
us
thank you.
today. We had a very nice conversation. I love this part too for us. And I want to invite all the people that watch us to keep reflecting in our reflection room.